The Magician of Lake Huron, an Ottawa tale related by Nabunwa in the Indian tongue to Mrs. George Johnston and carefully written down by Henry R. Schoolcraft. At the time the Ottawas inhabited the Manitoulin Islands in Lake Huron, here was a famous magician living among them whose name was Maswa Ini, or the living statue. It happened by the fortune of war that the Ottawa tribe was driven off the chain of islands by the Iroquois and obliged to flee away to the country lying between Lake Superior and the upper Mississippi, to the banks of the lakes which is still called by the French in the memory of his migration, Lac Cortel, or Lake of the Cutters, a term which is a nom de plume for this tribe. But the magician, Maswa Ini, remained behind on the wide-stretching and picturesque Manitoulins, a group of islands which have been deemed from the earliest times a favorite residence of the Manitus, or spirits. His object was to act as a sentinel to his countrymen and keep a close watch on their movements. He had with him 2 boys. With their aid he paddled stealthily around the shores, kept himself secreted in the nooks and bays, and hauled up his canoe every night into the thick woods and carefully obliterated his tracks upon the sand. One day he rose very early and started on a hunting excursion, leaving the boys asleep and limiting himself to the thick woods, lest he should be discovered. At length he came unexpectedly to the borders of an intensive open plain. After gazing around him and seeing no one, he directed his steps across it, intending to strike the opposite side of it. While traveling, he discovered a man of small stature, who appeared suddenly on the plain before him and advanced to meet him. He wore a red feather on his head, and coming up with a familiar air, accosted Maswa Ini by name and said gaily, "Where are you going?" He then took out his smoking apparatus and invited him to smoke. "Pray," said he, while thus engaged, "wherein does your strength lie?" "My strength," answered Maswa Ini, "is similar to the human race and common to the strength given to them, and no stronger." "We must wrestle," said the man of the red feather. "If you should make me fall, you will say to me, 'I have thrown you Waga Mina.'" As soon as they had finished smoking and put up their pipe, the wrestling began. For a long time the strife was doubtful. The strength of Maswa Ini was every moment growing fainter. The man of the red feather, though small of stature, proved himself very active. But at length he was spoiled and thrown to the ground. Immediately his adversary cried out, "I have thrown you, Wigi Mina," and in an instant his antagonist had vanished. On looking to the spot where he had fallen, he discovered a crooked ear of mandamin, or Indian corn, lying on the ground. "Now," said the speaking ear, for the voice came from it, "divest me of my covering, leave nothing to hide my body from your eyes. You must then separate me into parts, pulling off my body from the spine and scepter in small pieces near the edge of the woods, and return to visit the place after 1 moon." Maswa Ini obeyed these directions and immediately set out on his return to the lodge. On the way he killed a deer, and on reaching his canoe he found the boys still asleep. He awoke, told them to cook his venison, but he carefully concealed from them his adventure. At the expiration of the noon he again alone visited his wrestling ground, and to his surprise found the plain filled with the spikes and blades of new-grown corn. In the place where he had thrown the pieces of the cob he found pumpkin vines growing in great luxuriance. He concealed this discovery also carefully from the young lads, and after his return busied himself as usual in watching the movements of his enemies along the coasts of the islands. This he continued until summer drew near its close. He then directed his canoe to the coast of the part of the island where he had wrestled with the red plume, drew up his canoe, bid the lads to stay by it, and again visited the wrestling ground. He found the corn in full ear and pumpkins of immense size. He plucked ears of corn and gathered some of the pumpkins when a voice again addressed him from the cornfield. "Maswa Ini, you have conquered me. Had you not done so, your existence would have been forfeited. Victory has crowned our strength, and from henceforth you shall never be in want of my body. It will be nourishment for the human race." And thus the Indians received the gift of corn. Maswa now returned to his canoe and informed the young men of his discovery and showed them the specimens, and they were astonished and delighted with the novelty. There were in those days many wonderful things done on these islands. One night, while Masawani was lying down, he heard voices speaking, but he still kept his head covered as if he had not heard them. One voice said, "This is Masawini, and we must get his heart." "And what can we get it?" said another voice. "You must put your hand in his mouth," replied the first, "and draw it out that way." Maswaini still kept quiet and did not stir. He soon felt the hand of a person thrust in his mouth. When sufficiently far in, he bit off the fingers and thus escaped the danger. The voices then retired, and he was no further molested. On examining the fingers in the morning, what was his surprise was to find long wampum beads, which are held in such high estimation by all the Indian tribes. He slept as was his custom in the thick woods. On going out to the open shore at a very early hour, he saw a canoe at small distance, temporarily drawn up on the beach. On coming closer, he found a man in the bows and another in the stern, with their hands and arms extended in a fixed position. One of them had lost its fingers. It was evidently the man who had attempted to thrust his arm down his throat. There were two Pukwudgies, or fairies, but on looking closer they were found to be transformed into statues of stone, and he took these stone images on the shore and set them up in the woods. Their canoe was one of the most beautiful structures which it is possible to imagine, 4 fathoms in length, and filled with bags of treasures of every description and of the most exquisite workmanship. These bags were of different weight according to their contents. He busied into quickly carrying them into the woods together with the canoe, which he concealed in a cave. One of the fairy images then spoke to him and said, "In summer, the Ottawa canoes will hereafter be loaded when they pass along this coast, although your nations are driven away by their cruel enemies, the Iroquois." The day now began to dawn fully. When he returned to his 2 young companions, they were still asleep. He awoke them and exultantly bid them cook, for he had brought abundance of meat and fish, and other gifts of the fairies. After this display of good fortune, he bethought him of his aged father and mother, who were in exile at the Ottawa Lake. To wish and to accomplish his wish were but the work of an instant with Maswaini. One night, as he lay awake reflecting on their condition far away from their native fields and in exile, he resolved to visit them and bring them back to behold and to participate in his abundance. To a common traveler it would be a journey of 20 or 30 days, but Maswaini was at their lodge before daylight. He found them asleep and took them up softly in his arms and flew away with them through the air and brought them to his camp on the Manitolines, or Spirit Islands. When they awoke, their astonishment was at the highest pitch, and was only equaled by their delight in finding themselves in their son's lodge in their native country and surrounded with abundance. Maswaini went and built them a lodge near the cornfield and wrestling plain. He then plucked some ears of corn, and taking some of the pumpkins, brought them to his father and mother. He then told them how he had obtained the precious gift by wrestling with a spirit in red plumes, and that there was a great abundance of it in his fields. He also told them of the precious canoes of the fairies, loaded with sacks of the most costly and valuable articles. But one thing seemed necessary to complete the happiness of his father, which he observed by seeing him repeated at night looking into a smoking pouch. He comprehended his meaning in a moment. "It is tobacco, my father, that you want. You shall also have this comfort in 2 days." "But where," replied the old man, "can you get it, away from all supplies and surrounded by your enemies?" "My enemies," he answered, "shall supply it. I will go over to the Nadowas of the bear totem, and I will obtain your tobacco." The old man endeavored to dissuade him from the journey, knowing their bloodthirsty character, but in vain. Maswawani determined immediately to go. It was now winter weather. The lake was frozen over, but he set out on the ice, and although it is 40 leagues, he reached the village the same evening. The Nadawas discerned his coming. They were amazed at his swiftness of his motions, and thinking him somewhat supernatural, feared him and invited him to rest in their lodges. But he thanked them, saying that he preferred making a fire near the shore. In the evening they visited him and were anxious to know the object of his journey at so inclement a season, and he said he was merely to get some tobacco for his father. They immediately made a contribution of the article and gave it to him, and during the night, however, they laid a plot to kill him. Some of the old men rushed into his lodge, their leader crying out to him, "You are a dead man." "No, I am not," said Maswawani, "but you are." Accompanying his words with a blow of his tomahawk, which laid the Nadawa dead at his feet. Another and another came to supply the place of the fallen comrade, but he dispatched them in like manner as quickly as they came until he killed 6. He then took all the tobacco from their smoking pouches, and by this time the day began to dawn, and he set out for his father's lodge, which he reached with incredible speed, and before twilight spread out his trophies before the old man. When spring returned, his cornfield grew up without planting or any care on his part, and thus the maize was introduced among his people and their descendants, who have ever been noted and are at this day for their fine crops of this grain and their industry in its cultivation. It is from their custom of trading in this article that this tribe is called the Ottawas.